Hello, Thaís Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim the Podcast. I'm your host, and I am so happy to be here for another episode of Reclaim and a second episode in my newest series, Reclaiming What is Hard. If you're new around here, before I became a psychotherapist, I was a depth-oriented coach for over a decade. And I have seen, taught, and explored many ideas and concepts for how to navigate the complexities of being human. So in this podcast, I hope to disseminate some of those learnings and to help you maybe think differently about popular self-help, pop psych ideas so that you can find what's going to work for you, so that you can find ways to discern and add nuance and context to what you're learning so that it feels spacious and applicable for you. Every episode, I reclaim one topic. And today, I want to pick up where I left off in my new series called Reclaiming What is Hard. There are a lot of difficult parts of being human. And all of those things tend to fall around feelings that arise that are hard to tolerate, right? Feelings that we've never been taught to feel, or feelings that we have been told are bad, or feelings that now, when they arise, really paralyze and collapse us. And so I want to break down some of these difficult feelings. I want to shed light on what they may mean. I want to explore different ways of thinking and relating to them so that you may find some wisdom in what is hard. But before I get into the episode, I want to let you know that I do have some spaces currently available in my one-on-one work. I work with individuals and I work with couples in California as well as worldwide. Those of you who are wanting to work through deeply entrenched patterns, learn how to cultivate more intimacy and joy in your life. I work with trauma. I work with eating disorders. I work with people who want to cultivate deeper insight into themselves, who are grappling with relational difficulties, mood difficulties. You can learn more by going to my website, thaissky.com. There you can learn about what working with me with couples and what working with me with individuals look like. And if you're interested, if you want to learn more, you're more than welcome to reach out at info@thaissky.com. Generally, what I recommend is for us to hop on a 15-minute call so I can get to know more about you, answer any questions that you may have, and decide together what it would look like moving forward. Again, you can go to thaissky.com to learn more. Okay, so last episode of the Reclaiming What is Hard series, I talked all about regret. Today, I want to talk about anger. Anger, I think, is very misunderstood, and yet it's also very common. So let's explore it a little bit and see if we can make sense of why it is both very common and also why it can be hard to tolerate. Now, at its most basic essence, anger is an emotion, often in response to an experience of boundary violation, a threat to self, right? A threat of some kind, an injustice of some kind. Usually anger arises when we feel like something is being violated. Now, it's very tempting, I think, with all emotional experiences for us to merge what we are feeling and what is happening. And I want to start this episode by saying that just because you are feeling angry doesn't necessarily mean that that is what is happening. This can mean a lot of things, and it can get very confusing for us to then be able to discern, well, do I have a right then to feel anger if it's not necessarily what's happening? How do I know what's happening? How do I know if my anger is justified? What do I do with my anger if I don't know if it is what it is happening? And with other emotions, I think we can often feel a little bit more spacious around whether or not it is happening versus what we are experiencing. But I think with anger, we can move so quickly into feeling righteous and feeling like our anger is the right emotion to have that we spend actually very little time questioning whether what is happening is actually what is happening. And that can then be very tricky because anger can be very damaging. And so I think as we expand our capacity to actually just tolerate anger, we actually then make more space for us to decide, for us to determine what's really going on. And it's not to say that if what is going on isn't a violation of some kind, that it means that you shouldn't experience anger. You are allowed to experience whatever you experience. Your feelings are your own. Your feelings are valid. Your feelings are allowed to be there. Whether or not what's actually happening is not the point. The point is you're having an emotional experience and you're allowed to have that emotional experience. Now, how you respond, how you react, how you take action on your emotional experience, that's where there is some choice. That is where we are invited to spend a little bit more time, because what often happens when we feel a certain way and then take action on that feeling as if that's what's happening is we collapse our thinking, we collapse our ability to understand what's happening. We often collapse the external experience, and then sometimes we create repercussions or consequences that we don't actually intend. So there's a lot of mindfulness, Buddhist, spiritual philosophies that talk about the importance of slowing down, right? What is the famous quote, between the action and the reaction? That is where we often have the space to decide what we want to do. And the more we can create space between what is happening and how we respond to it, the more choice we have. But this can be really, really hard when it comes to something like anger, because anger is hot, anger is fast, anger is all-encompassing. It can feel really hard to slow down. It can be really hard to tolerate. And that's what I want to kind of help us to explore a little bit more today. Hopefully, if you have some more ideas about anger, if you have some more concepts or some more thoughts about it, it will help you in those moments when you're feeling really alive with the anger to decide how you want to navigate it. So one of the things that, can be helpful when we're first exploring anger is to think about what is our relationship with anger? Like when you find yourself getting angry, how do you think of it? Do you think of it as like, I like my anger? Do you think of it like, I hate my anger? I hate feeling angry. Do we think about anger as like, there's no point in feeling angry? I don't trust my anger. Like, what is your relationship with your anger? Because if we say something like, I don't trust my anger, or I don't like anger, or there's no point in feeling angry, that tells us a lot about how we may have been related to in our anger. It's really frustrating when we feel like there is no point in the anger, because it doesn't actually then it doesn't stop the anger from arising. But what it does do is it then shames us for having this very natural experience. Becomes like a closed loop where then we try to shame ourselves from not having a feeling that we are just having. And so there's nowhere for the anger to go. The shame can really destabilize us or paralyze us. We tend to then feel really alone in it. And it kind of exacerbates the sense of like, see, there is no point in feeling angry. Because look, it just creates more shame. It just creates a real sense of badness, and it becomes kind of like a self-fulfilling loop. And what I'm inviting us here is to consider that maybe anger is a normal emotion. Like anger is totally normal to experience. It's something that we are allowed to experience. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person for feeling angry. It doesn't mean that there's something wicked or wrong or bad if you feel anger. And if those are your those are your experiences with anger, that probably says more about how you were raised to relate to your anger, how others related to you in your anger, more so than the actual experience of anger. Other questions that could be helpful for you to invite some curiosity around is like, who was allowed to be angry in your family of origin? What did expressions of anger look like in your family of origin? How were you related to when you got angry? If you spend time with children for any length of time, they will get angry. There's all sorts of things that are very unfair for children. They will get angry because angry is a normal human experience, and children are going to get angry. There are all sorts of reasons why. They can't put their hand in the stove. They can't steal the toy from their sister. Like there's all sorts of reason for why kids may get angry. However, It is how they are related to in that anger that will really determine how then they experience their anger moving forward. Do they find that their anger is constantly dismissed or devalued? Do they find that their anger is met with more anger and rage from the caregiver? If you really think about how anger was held in your family, you probably are already now developing some insight into how you now may relate to your own anger. When we're thinking about developing a relationship with our anger, we first have to think about how we were related to our anger. Our relationship to ourselves, our relationship to our feelings stem out of how we were related to. Nothing happens in a microcosm. So if we want to be thinking about our anger, we have to start at the beginning. So if we're like, okay, Thaís, let's just take the premise that maybe anger is like a totally normal and healthy feeling to have. What does a healthy relationship with anger look like? Like, what does that even mean? So step one, I think one really important way that we know that we're developing or working towards a healthier, more spacious relationship with our anger is that we know when we're angry. This alone is going to comprise of the majority of our conversation today, is the ways in which we suppress our anger, and then the anger kind of shows up in other ways that are unexpected, that you may not have connected with anger. Because we were taught that in some way, shape, or form, our anger and having an expression of anger was not tolerated, was not allowed. And now it has to come through in different ways. So we can't ever suppress anger. Like, that doesn't work. We can't ever push it down successfully. Whatever we push down is just going to come through another way. And so even knowing that we're angry is a really, really important big step towards developing a healthier relationship with our anger. Knowing what anger feels like in our bodies, knowing what the experience of anger is like within ourselves is already a really big and difficult step, because it means that we have to be able to tolerate the anger without sliding into shame, or without sliding into rage, or without sliding into trying to express it in some kind of punitive, demonstrative, abusive way, right? So, that's kind of step two. A really important, healthy relationship with anger is one in which we can notice that we're angry without acting out, shutting down, or turning against the self. Now, what do I mean by acting out? I mean being able to express anger without punishment or withdrawal, without screaming, yelling, without falling into kind of abusive behavior like hitting, name calling, right? If we're finding ourselves getting so angry that we are pushing people, or that we are screaming at people, or that we are name calling, or that we are saying really cruel things, when we express anger in that way, what we're actually doing in those moments is showing ourselves and the other person that we're not actually able to tolerate the anger. And that's why it has to come out. Sometimes it can be helpful to think of acting out or expressing an emotion as a way in which we're not actually tolerating it. Because if we were able to sit with our anger, we can feel it in our bodies, we can feel the thoughts that are associated with it, and we can talk about it. We can say, I'm really angry right now, and I'm really having a hard time feeling this without wanting to punish you or act out or lash out or scream at you. That shows a healthier relationship with our anger, because it means that we are demonstrating a capacity to name it, to bear it, to talk about it without trying to kind of hurt the other person. This can be really hard with anger, because anger, often when it shows up, it's blaring loud. It's screaming at us. Fight, 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 hurt, attack. We're in danger, which is very biological, right? If we are fighting a tiger, if we're, in the caveman era or whatever, and we're in danger and we're angry, like, it makes sense that we are then biologically being moved into action. So it can be really, really hard to experience anger without acting out. But that is a sign that we are expanding our capacity to tolerate anger, is when we are able to feel the anger without pushing away. And then another one, of course, is without withdrawing or shutting down. And usually when we shut down, it's because we're trying to essentially dissociate from the experience of the emotion. We're trying to shut the feeling down ourselves. It's so overwhelming. It's like our computer overheating, right? It just wants to shut down. That's another sign that what we're experiencing is really unbearable. And then another way is turning against the self. So what do I mean by that? I mean, notice when We are having an emotional experience, which is usually a relational experience, because usually our emotions are stirred up in relationship to another. Let's say you're having a conversation with a friend, and you find out this friend tells you that she, I don't know, let you down in some way. She said that she was going to do something and then she didn't do it. And you find yourself getting really angry at her. So to act out would be to yell at her. How dare you, you son of a gun, right? Like acting out would be like stomping out, slamming the door, and leaving her. Acting out would be pushing her, right? Like acting out would be saying something really cruel to her. Shutting down would be to say something like, it's fine, never mind, I don't care anyway, it doesn't matter. Right? It doesn't matter that you let me down. I don't care. Whatever. It wasn't important to me anyway. Shutting down means I can't talk to you anymore. You don't deserve my friendship. I'm ending this relationship. That, and then leaving. Shutting down, acting out can all have overlaps, of course, but the general attitude here is I can't bear what you're bringing. I can't bear the emotions that you're stirring up. So I just got to shut you down. Now, that is different from a very healthy and helpful way of navigating our anger, is to say, you know what, I'm getting really angry at you right now. This is like really, I'm going to say something I'm going to regret. I need a timeout. I need a moment. I need 5 minutes. I need 20 minutes. I need a day to think about what you've done. Let's touch base next week. Let's touch base tomorrow. The difference is that we're not threatening the relationship. We're not making some rash decision like, I just can't, I can't ever be friends with you again, right? When we're making these rash decisions in a moment of anger, we're trying to dissipate the anger. We're trying to do something so we don't have to feel something. And when we do that, we're not really thinking long term. We're kind of split, right? We're no longer thinking about the context of the friendship. We're no longer thinking about the longevity of the friendship. We're no longer kind of thinking at all. We're just wanting to evacuate the feeling. And so that it's tempting to do. And we often find ourselves doing it. And then we break up with our boyfriends. We quit our jobs. And then the next day we are filled with remorse. We're filled with regret. We get back together with the boyfriend and it just becomes this yo-yo. A healthier expression of anger would be to say, I'm really upset. I need a break. I need a moment. I need to think. I need some separation. Let's get back together at a certain point of time in the future to discuss, to talk more about this later. Okay. And then the other one is turning against the self. So this is, all these things can happen interchangeably. It's not like it has to be one or the other. But when we turn against the self, what we're doing in those moments is we immediately go to, see, I shouldn't have trusted her. Why did I trust her? I'm so stupid for having trusted her. This is all my fault. If I didn't trust her, if I didn't lean on her, then I wouldn't be disappointed. I wouldn't be now so angry at her. We turn that anger towards ourselves, right? Like, I did something wrong. I shouldn't have done this. How could I have done this? How could I have trusted her? This is what happens when you trust people. When we turn against the self, what we're trying again to do there is dissipate the anger by learning a lesson, right? The lesson being that you're bad. And if you could just learn it, if you could just learn to not trust people, then you wouldn't feel this way. But we can see how that's actually a pretty kind of toxic or poisonous or kind of problematic way of thinking. What are we going to do? Never going to trust people again? Like, that's not possible. And that only serves to isolate us and, kind of detach us from the world, which I know in those moments can feel very seductive. And it's okay for having kind of these seductive thoughts in the moment. But if we take action on it, we're really shooting ourselves in the foot in the long term. Because the lesson here, if somebody disappoints us, if somebody betrays us, isn't to not trust people again. That's not a long-term kind of solution. Temporarily, short-term, we may think that, we may have fantasy, we may have all sorts of fantasies and ideas that we should never. That's all good. It's fine. We can have all those thoughts. But if we start to then try to orient our lives like that's how we should do it, we're really missing out on the fact that people are going to disappoint us. People suck sometimes. Like, people just are disappointing. And we're allowed to feel angry. We're allowed to feel betrayed. We're allowed to have all those feelings. It doesn't necessarily mean that we did something wrong. It doesn't even necessarily mean that like all people are bad. This is just a part of relationshiping. But it's helpful to notice like what gets us angry? What do we notice really infuriates us and what doesn't? This is back to like some other kind of helpful, useful questions that we may ask ourselves about anger. There are really interesting ways in which we may find ourselves getting angry at certain things, but not other things. So we may have a tolerance for certain things, but not other things. And that's all really useful to understand more of ourselves. Like, why is it that that infuriates us, but all these other things don't? Why is it that when these things happen, we kind of turn against ourselves and we get really angry at ourselves, but when these things happen, we have no problem being angry at the other person? What's happening when we're trying to turn against the self, I think one of the kind of predominant ways that we probably have been related to, if we're finding ourselves consistently turning the anger towards ourselves, is the message that there's no point in being angry at the other person. That to be angry at the other person doesn't lead to anything fruitful, doesn't lead to anything useful, it doesn't change anything. And so the only way then we know how to tolerate this anger is to turn it then against us, against ourselves, with the hopes that then there is something that we can do, right? That we can change our behavior in some way to make sure that this doesn't happen again. It's a form of kind of control. It's a way that we're detaching ourselves from the outside in an effort to protect ourselves. Turning against the self is a very common way that a lot of people pleasers, perfectionists tend to orient themselves in the world. People with kind of really big grapplings of worthiness wounds, they tend to turn a lot of stuff against themselves. If only if I were better, if I were more perfect, if I were nicer, if I were blank, then this wouldn't have happened. And it's a seductive way of thinking because temporarily it makes us feel like we are in control. But the demands that we're putting on ourselves are really impossible. Like what, you can be so perfect that no one's going to disappoint you, right? Like you can be so, it's an omnipotent type mentality. We're really believing that we have a lot more control than we do. The more difficult reality to face is that people are going to disappoint us no matter how good or perfect or kind or sweet or whatever we are. Because people have their own ability, autonomy, their own say, their own stuff going on. And that's not always a reflection on us. People being disappointing is a fact of life, no matter how we are. But the fantasy is that if we are perfect enough or good enough or people pleasing enough, then we won't experience these feelings. And that's just not how it works. Okay, back to anger. So a healthy relationship with anger looks like knowing when we're angry. It looks like being able to express anger, being able to communicate and be in our anger without retaliating, punishment, withdrawing, acting out, shutting down, turning against the self. And oftentimes developing or having a healthier relationship with anger stems out of having a caregivers that were able to tolerate our anger and help us make sense of our feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, despair. If our caregivers were able to digest our anger, if our caregivers were able to say something along the lines of, you're allowed to be angry at me. Like, I'm not going to get mad at you for being angry at me. This is unfair. Life is unfair. I know it sucks. Here, like, what if we do this? Or I'll just be able to be in the anger with you. Sometimes that means changing things. Sometimes it means just being angry together. We often then come out of that childhood having a more fuller experience of our own anger. Unfortunately, that's really not most of our upbringing. It's actually, most of us have been taught in some way, shape, or form that we just need to stop being angry. And so, of course, then that can often then turn into us having a pretty difficult relationship with our anger moving forward in our adulthood. Now, of course, there's when we're talking about anger, we can't go much further without talking about the kind of problematic expressions of anger, right? These are ways in which are actually quite harmful, like verbal attacks and abuse, physical abuse, violence of some kind. And this is where anger tends to get a bad rep because we tend to see people who do that and say that, see, anger does that. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to hit people or I don't want to kind of ruin people's property. Like, I don't want to do that. So therefore, it's better if I just don't have anger or don't feel anger. So this is where anger can really get a bad rep. But like I said before, this type of manifestation of anger is actually a sign of our inability to tolerate anger and wanting to kind of dispel it, wanting to take it out of ourselves. If we hit another person, then they feel the helplessness that we're having a hard time bearing and feeling, right? If we're destroying something of theirs, then maybe they will be angry and feel something that we're feeling, and then we're not as alone in our anger. Have you ever noticed that? Like, if you're in a fight with somebody and you're really angry, the kind of wish that you have in those moments is that the other person also get angry. Like, get angry. In some ways, there's some conversations out there that being angry at one another is actually a healthy sign that there's a lot of care going on, like in relationship. I'm not talking about these problematic expressions of anger, to be clear. I'm talking about when we're feeling angry at the other person, what we're doing is we're in some ways demonstrating that we are caring a lot about what's happening in the relationship. And it's actually indifference. That's a sign that the relationship is really kind of falling apart. If we're indifferent, if we're experiencing apathy, if we're like, you know what, whatever, I don't care anymore, that's a sign that the relationship is falling apart. That's an interesting way to think about it. I think that there's some merit there. I think anger can be really, really hard to navigate in relationship, again, without it falling into these kind of more difficult, problematic dynamics. But I think that this is where a lot of work can be really helpful in couples therapy, is like, can there be anger in the relationship without it turning into these expressions? Because our intimate partners can be really infuriating. Like, there's nothing like the experience of anger, rage, and frustration that inevitably occur in our intimate relationships. It can be really infuriating. Our intimate partnerships can stir up the most difficult feelings in us. And so being able to bear it with the other person is actually a really important part of intimate partnerships. Okay, so even though, you know, anger can get a really bad rap, particularly how it's shown in the media, how it's shown, how maybe we experienced it, there's nothing like being a child and having a really angry parent screaming at us for us to kind of internalize that there's something really dangerous and problematic about anger. It can be now really, really hard as adults to be with anger. So what can often happen is that anger kind of gets repressed. It can get kind of pushed down. It can then show up in different ways. And we're going to talk about that in just a little bit of time. But first, there's some interesting facets of anger that I find really helpful to think about. One, wanting the other person to feel anger when we're angry can often feel very validating. Like I mentioned just a little bit ago, when we're feeling really angry, it can be really, really, it can feel like the only way that this anger will dissipate is if the other person is angry too. And so we try to push them, right? Like, we try to kind of say the thing, do the thing that will get them to get really angry back. And that's really interesting. Like, what's happening there for us when we're so angry, and that the only way we feel like we'll be able to be met in our anger is if the other person is angry too. I wonder if there's something there about mirroring, about seeing anger in another allows us to then feel like our anger is okay. I wonder if there's something about twinship, like a sense of, if the other person's angry, then it's okay that we're angry. I wonder if there's something there about feeling contained, like we're not alone in our anger. Oftentimes it can feel very, very isolating to feel really alone in our anger. And that's why we often then notice we can often go to certain communities, like online spaces where we know we're going to be validated in our anger. This can often feel really good short term, but it can lead into a really kind of stagnant, rage fest filled environment that leads into like a righteousness that can get kind of problematic or kind of can get really painful. But it's interesting, right? When we get really angry, how often we then will go online and find other people who are angry, and it just makes us feel so less alone. And I think that that really speaks to how isolating anger can be, and how hard it can be for other people to tolerate anger in another person. We often, when our partner is angry, we often try to get them to not be angry. It can be really, really hard to stay in someone's anger, especially if it's directed towards us, but even like in general. If like a partner comes home and they're really angry at their boss, it can feel really seductive to want to kind of get them to not feel angry. And again, I think it's because there is a kind of element of danger to the anger, right? Maybe we're afraid that if our partner gets angry at their boss, they're going to quit their job. They're going to act out on that anger. And so we want to kind of calm them down. We're afraid that that anger is going to lead into something really painful or a consequence that we don't want to endure. And so we think we're doing them a favor and ourselves a favor by calming them down, by bringing them out of their anger. That's not to say that sometimes that's not helpful, that's not useful, that's not important, but we also want to think about, what happens long term if a person's anger is never met, it's never held, it's never kind of allowed to be in existence. Where does that anger go? Wanting to win and conquer in a fight when we're really angry can be a way that we're trying to destroy the other person. And in a way, we lose touch with the other person's fullness, right? Like how interesting when we are fighting with our intimate partners, we immediately kind of lose the context of the relationship. We forget that we actually love that person. We forget that like we're building a life with this person. We forget that like what we actually ultimately want is to feel partnered and connected with the person. And the only thing that we actually experience in these moments when we're very angry is I'm right, they're wrong. They must know that they're wrong. And I want them to feel as much of their wrongness as possible. We want to win. We want to conquer. We want to show them that like we're the boss, we're the winner. And the thing is, like, that may work. We may get there. We may succeed in getting them to feel really bad, feel really wrong. But it doesn't ultimately, I think, allow us to feel what we really want to feel, which is that like the sense of feeling partnered and understood, and that the anger can be made sense of together. When we want to destroy the other person, when we lose touch of the wholeness of the other person, we can then find ourselves doing a lot of damage to the relationship. But again, in those moments, it's like we don't see the problem in that because we just want to destroy. But this is a really dangerous way of relating to people. We do this all the time, right? The minute we're angry, we just like lose sight of all of the good of the other person. We just want to destroy them. And if we continue to do that, there will be a point where we may actually succeed in destroying not them, but the relationship. But that's what anger can do. It can really kind of narrow our experience of the other. And then that can be, really, it may feel really good in the moment, but it probably doesn't, it won't probably lead to the type of relationships you want long term. I think another really important facet of anger that warrants just a quick discussion is this idea sometimes that, with anger, like we want to work through the injustice of the past by being empowered now. A lot of times anger can feel very empowering. It can feel like we're no longer going to accept this injustice that we've been forced to accept in the past. Like anger can often feel like we're trying to advocate for ourselves in a way that we didn't advocate for ourselves then. The kind of challenge with this is that it can feel very, the problem with trying to work through something in the past, in the future, is that we actually can't undo the past. Like that's the fantasy. The fantasy is if we can finally advocate for ourselves now in the way that we couldn't then, we will undo what happened then. We will feel finally restored in some way. But we actually can't undo the past. The past is done. We cannot restore something that has been broken in the past. The best that we can do is mourn and tend to the broken parts and find a way of putting the broken parts together to create something really regenerative and useful and beautiful now. But just like if a clay pot, if we throw it on the floor. We can't undo that. We can't, no matter how angry we get at future people, we cannot restore the brokenness of that pot. We can put it back together. There's like a Japanese art to it of putting it back together like melted gold. Like it can become really beautiful. It can become something even better in some ways now. We can't ever go back to a whole pot. And I think anger can play a really wonderful role in helping us make sense of and make meaning of the brokenness of the past. We want to be careful in thinking that it can undo, because what happens when we move through our lives with this unconscious attempts to undo the past is that we will always feel like we are filling a hole that cannot be filled. And this is really hard to confront. It's not to say that we can't use the pain of the past to correct the injustices of the world now. I know so many people who, because of the ways in which they were harmed as children, now are working really hard to prevent that type of harm from happening to other children or to other people. And I think that that is a courageous and bold and beautiful way of making sense of the past and using our wounds to find meaning and purpose. There's something that can be really useful and profound about it. But if we're not also mourning and confronting the reality, which is that we can never really undo the past, we're going to continue to try to feel empty. We're going to continue to feel really burned out. Anger can be a really important emotion to get in touch with and to kind of help us orient into what's important to us and to our values and to what's feeling wrong. But it's not an emotion that I find can fuel us long term, because it can really burn us out. Anger can lead to righteousness, which again, sometimes can have usefulness and utility. And sometimes it can really, propel us into some pretty close-minded attitudes that can actually get in the way of the very thing that we're trying to restore or recreate or rework. Okay. A couple other things I want to talk about before we talk about repressed anger. One, there's a really common idea that anger is a secondary emotion. If you Google it, you'll often find anger being talked about as a secondary emotion. If you're in like kind of trying to heal and work through, a lot of times people will find it useful to say, well, what's beneath the anger? Like what's underneath the anger? You know, anger is secondary. Now, I think the reason why we think of anger as a secondary emotion is because oftentimes it's a response to other emotions, such as fear, sadness, or embarrassment. It's like the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, to mask other feelings that are harder to bear. Like it's really hard to bear helplessness. And so we move into anger because anger then empowers us into action. It moves us into wanting to do something. So then we don't have to tolerate the fear or the helplessness or these emotions that are harder to kind of move through. The problem with this idea of thinking about it, it's not that there isn't merit. I think that there are. I think that sometimes anger does serve to mask other feelings. I think sometimes it's easier to feel one feeling than the other. For some of us, it's easier to be in the anger than to be in the sadness, for example. A lot of times, certain emotions go hand in hand with other emotions, like sadness and anger. They tend to go together. They tend to find itself in similar experiences. The only problem, though, with seeing it as a secondary emotion is that then we then are treating anger as if there's no utility to the anger itself. You know, it's a way that we can bypass the anger. It's a way that we can overlook the anger. And I think that is short-sighted. I think that there's anger and then there is sadness. And if they are going hand in hand for you, if you're constantly finding yourself moving away from sadness and into anger, that's information. But that doesn't mean that the anger doesn't also have information to think about. I think we want to think about anger as an emotion in and of itself that has important information for how we may be experiencing something or how we may be trying to make sense of something inside of ourselves. And also get to know if usually anger is a way that we try to avoid some other feelings. But I don't like the idea of it being just a secondary emotion because it means it's not as important. For some of us, sadness is actually the secondary emotion. It may be easier for us to go into sadness than to go into anger. And so it's not necessarily true that anger is always a secondary emotion. Sometimes there are other emotions because we have a hard time tolerating anger. If you find yourself never being angry, that's not a sign that like you're more enlightened or more spiritual or like a better person. Sorry to say. If you never experience anger, odds are you're probably suppressing it and probably not doing a very good job. Because anger, like I've been saying, is a perfectly valid and important emotional experience. And so if you're never feeling it, that's suspicious. How is it that you're never experiencing any form of violation? You're never experiencing a boundary crossing? Like, come on, like that just doesn't happen. And we tend to think that way. We tend to think like, oh, if we're zen enough, if we're able to let go, if we're able to be in acceptance enough, we would never feel things like anger. And I don't like that. If we really try to dismiss the complexities of our internal experiences when we do that. So the problem with this idea, it's not that there isn't merit. It's not that there can't be useful to think about it that way, but let's just make sure that we're not glazing over the anger to try to get to some core emotion, as if anger itself doesn't have a role to play here in our internal system and like how the whole thing of how it's coming up for us inside. The benefit of thinking about anger as a secondary emotion is that it keeps us curious. And I really like this. If we're relating to anger as a secondary emotion, when we feel angry, that means that we're then being like, oh, I wonder what else is here. And I like that. I like that space of curiosity, because what we're doing there is we're kind of keeping our mind on. We're keeping our mind in the curiosity rather than collapsing fully into the anger, as if there's nothing else going on. And so that is what I do like about thinking of anger as a secondary emotion, is that if we can, when we're angry, to be like, I wonder what's really happening here. Why are we feeling angry? Is there anything else that we're feeling? What may the function that anger is playing for us here? Why are we angry? How are we experiencing this? If we're thinking about it this way with a stance of curiosity, not a stance of shaming, then we may find ourselves staying in our mind, staying curious rather than collapsing into the anger or collapsing into the shame. Yes? So for that reason, I like that way of thinking. Okay. So let's talk about how repressed anger may show up. Now, we may feel like it's pointless to feel anger if anger was seen as something that would not change reality, that would not change the other, that would not be able to be digested by the other. If we're getting angry and our parents say, stop being angry, or don't do that, or go to your room. Anytime we felt angry, we may start to internalize that there is no space for anger. Anger doesn't do anything. So what that does is it represses it. It doesn't make it go away. It represses it. And we may not even know now that the anger is repressed. We may just see the ramifications of the repression of it. We may not be doing it consciously anymore. So here's like a non-exhaustive list of some of the ways in which maybe a sign of repressed anger. I'm not saying that all of these things are inherently repressed anger. I am just saying that sometimes these are the ways that repressed anger manifests. A big one, a popular one for a lot of people that I work with is people pleasing. If we are so oriented to pleasing others, to trying to make ourselves so accommodating, so that we are violating our own boundaries in order to make the other happy, there is anger there. Inevitably, right? Because part of people pleasing is being willing to do what is not natural or normal for us to do because we prioritize the other person's perception of us over our own boundary. A lot of people pleasers find themselves doing things that they don't really want to do, accommodating in ways that they don't really want, saying yes to things that they don't really want to do, all in the service of trying to please the other. This entire thing that we're doing here is inevitably going to stir up anger. We're angry that we have to do something we don't want to do in order to maintain the relationship, or at least that's what we're envisioning, that that's what we have to do to maintain the relationship. We're angry at having to do all of this accommodating and then finding that other people aren't willing to do it for ourselves. We're angry that all this work of people pleasing is getting in the way of us doing the things that we want to do. There is usually so much anger associated with people pleasing, but oftentimes that anger is completely unconscious. It's completely out of our mind. And the only way that we're experiencing it is, I just have to work harder. If it's not working, if the people pleasing isn't working, if I'm experiencing frustration, it means that I'm not working hard enough to please the other person. Because there's often a purity associated with people pleasing. We not only want to make other people happy, but we want it. And if there's any part of us that doesn't want it or that resists it, it means that there's something wrong with us. Because if we were the perfect people that we want to be, we would always want to prioritize the other. So people-pleasing, anger usually go hand in hand, and oftentimes in the process of kind of unsticking ourselves from all these people-pleasing tendencies, part of that journey, part of that experience is going to look like getting in touch with our anger and finding ways to work with our anger so that we can start to detach who we are from who we think other people are, who we think other people think of us. Okay, other ways that we repress anger is through rage, which is interesting because for some of us, if we go from 0 to 100, if we're like totally fine 1 minute and then we find ourselves getting explosive, getting into so much rage, so much kind of unrelenting anger, that is usually a sign that the anger has been suppressed, because we don't usually go from 0 to 100 unless we have been pushing down, and then boom, out it comes, it comes out so explosively. The anger has been there, my friends. The anger has been there. You haven't been wanting to touch it. You haven't been wanting to be aware of it. It's going to come out. And so if you find yourself having these bouts of rage, if you find yourself being like totally at peace 1 minute and then boom, exploding the next minute, our work there is going to be to start to notice the smaller hints of anger, of injustice, of frustration, so that we can get to a place where we can notice the anger and experience the anger without going it from 0 to 100. There is this interesting idea when we're talking about rage, of this idea of narcissistic rage, which comes out of Koha in self-psychology, for those of you who are interested in psychoanalysis. So the way that he thinks about it is that regular anger or aggression is about defending boundaries. But narcissistic rage has a much stronger offensive intent. The aggression doesn't end when the boundary threat is removed. Have you noticed? Have you ever felt that way? Where you've gotten really angry that there's a boundary violation and then that's taken care of. That's no longer a problem. But the rage is still there. The aggression is still there. The desire to destroy is still there. So the aggression doesn't end when the threat is removed. The intent in those moments, in that aggression, in that rage, is to cause harm to others. It's not just to defend the self. Now, he calls it a narcissistic rage because he associates it with a narcissistic injury, which means that we're kind of experiencing something as an injury to our ego, as an injury to our sense of self. We are feeling attacked or threatened. A core sense of ourselves is being attacked, is being threatened. We have a wound or a sensitivity, and then that wound is getting pressed. And then what happens is we get in touch with this kind of narcissistic rage. It's helpful to notice if that is happening, because then we can start to maybe get in touch with our aggression, our rage, what is going on internally for us without it necessarily then having to be acted on. Aggression is such an intertwined part of anger, and we all have it. We all have moments where we are very much wanting to destroy and hurt the other. We are animals at the end of the day. Of course, we're going to experience aggression. The question is, can you notice it? Can you tolerate it? Can you talk about it? Or does it immediately get acted out? If you find yourself acting it out, you're probably going to find yourself really impacting the quality of the relationships that you have. So if you find yourself being very aggressive at times or very righteous, very angry in ways that are very destructive, that's an invitation that there may be some work to be done so that you can find ways to be with your anger. You can find ways to be with people in your anger without destroying the relationship. Another way that anger tends to show up repressed is through depression. This is a very, very old idea that depression is a lot of suppressed anger, that there is no place for that anger to go. It gets very suppressed, and then that depression serves as a dampener. It kind of serves as a way to kind of keep all that stuff down. And so, of course, the treatment then, the work is going to be to bring out the anger so that the depression can lift. And then, like I mentioned before, another really popular, common way that repressed anger shows up is through turning it against the self. And one of the ways that it can get turned against the self is through very low self-worth or low self-esteem. Because when we are critiquing ourselves so harshly for any internal experience, any error, any mistake, any emotion that we're experiencing that we feel like means that there's something bad or wrong with us, we can't possibly then have a high self-esteem or a high sense of self-worth. We are kind of trying to destroy ourselves from the inside out. So it's that aggression, it's that destructive nature of anger turned against ourselves. How can we build a healthy esteem, a healthy sense of self, if at any turn we are finding ourselves just trying to eradicate ourselves? It's just not possible. Yes. And so, of course, one of the main kind of ways in which we find ourselves justifying repressed anger, because, of course, we have to find ways to justify why we do what we do in order to bridge the dissonance in ourselves, right, is by believing that if we get angry, we're never going to stop, that we're always going to be angry. If we really let ourselves get in touch with the injustices of the world, if we really let ourselves get in touch with just how wronged we were, how limited our parents were, how frustrating life is. If we really let ourselves get in touch with all that anger, it's going to be unrelenting. We're going to be an angry person. So what's happening there? If we find ourselves being unrelenting in our anger, oftentimes, we may have found a way to relate to anger so that it feels like it allows us to stay in control. If we are constantly angry at the world, constantly kind of in this place of stagnant anger, we may find a constant state of feeling empowered, right? Because a lot of times anger allows us to feel empowered. We're doing something with the injustice. We're doing something with the boundary violation. So if we're constantly getting angry, we're probably constantly experiencing the world as being against us, that things are happening to us. And feeling angry has felt like a way that we can then be in control of all of the helplessness of our lives. And so there is something to be said about finding ourselves so angry so often, is that we're, again, constantly experiencing the world as against us. And, the complicated reality is that oftentimes if we're experiencing the world that way, we're probably in touch with something that has been true for us, that we probably were the victim of a lot of really painful things. And so we're continuing to experience the world now as we did then, which is a sign that something is not getting worked through, that something about the past is continuing to show up in our lives as an opportunity for us to work through it. But if we don't know that, then we're we're probably just finding ourselves getting into that kind of unrelenting anger. It's just not true, though, that if you allow yourself to be angry, that you're always going to be angry. Anger, like all other emotions, is meant to kind of move through us. It's just, if it's getting stuck and stagnant and we're like always in it, there's something that needs to be worked through. Something that's been baked into our personality and how we've oriented ourselves in the world that we have an invitation now to navigate, work through, and heal. I don't believe that if you let yourself feel angry now, that it means you're always going to be angry. But if you've never allowed yourself to feel anger, then you're probably, gonna feel now like any even little bit of anger is out of control or is really overwhelming or is really terrifying. And again, the opportunity is to expand our capacity to be with the anger, not to continue to justify why we shouldn't be angry. So it's just not true. I work with a lot of people who are grappling with eating disorders. And one of the common feelings that we have is, if I let myself eat this thing, then I'm never going to stop. There's a sense of being out of control. And I think that is why the repressed anger works, is because we felt that anger moved us into a place of out of control. People pleasing, depression, it's all a way that we're trying to be in control of something that feels intolerable and out of control. The problem is it doesn't work. It comes at a really high cost. And so the work is not to then never have the food, because if you have it, you're never going to stop eating it, but to expand our trust, our ability, our capacity to tolerate our anger, our feelings, our hunger, and our ability to stop, our ability to move through. Often this just can't happen in isolation, and that's where getting support like psychotherapy can be really helpful. But then there's a different group of people, the people who are constantly angry, right? Like, who are just always angry about everything and are not very enjoyable people to be around. We all know that person, and we try very hard not to be that person, right? Because it's not enjoyable to be around those people. But what we can kind of notice when we are around those people is that there's something really stagnant about their anger. They're kind of finding fresh ways to keep the anger alive, but that anger is metastasized into like this growth of pain. And there's often a sense that there's a lot of suffering that is not getting addressed and that is kept down and denied by just staying angry. Righteousness is often a way that we try to kind of hold on to ourselves. If we feel righteousness, then we can feel whole. We can feel like we're allowed to feel this way. And if we've been told a lot that we're not allowed to feel certain things, then to feel righteous is a way that we kind of stay cohesive in ourselves. It's a way that we try to hold ourselves together. There's often times when we're very sensitive to feeling righteous. There's often a sign that we've been very invalidated, and that we've been very gaslit or told in many different ways that we can't feel the way we feel. And so we use righteousness as a shield, as a defense. Like, no, look, I'm going to point out all of the ways in which I definitely feel entitled to feel this way. Oftentimes what we're doing there, though, with that shield is we're preventing people from actually being in the anger with us and witnessing us or holding our anger or amending. And we're using the shield in a way to block people out from invalidating us, but then we're also blocking people out from being in our pain with us. Oftentimes, again, it's because we've never experienced people being in the pain with us. So there's an opportunity there for some healing. But if we stay too long in the righteousness, I think that there's like a Buddhist idea, right? About like, if we hold on to like a hot coal, we're burning ourselves too, like holding on too dearly our anger is burning ourselves. We're hurting ourselves too. We're not actually able to live a very vital life if we're so clung to our anger. But it can feel really, really scary to let that go if it means that then we feel like we're then allowing people to treat us however way they want. There's space there for us to kind of then do some work so that we don't actually have to keep using anger as a shield to protect. Because as long as we're continuing to experience the world as against us, we're going to continually need a shield to protect us, which can keep out a lot of the intimacy and joy that we want. Okay, so the final thing I want to leave us with is, again, this question, like, are you allowed to feel anger? Are you allowed to feel how you feel, even if it's not necessarily kind of reflective in what's happening? And the answer is yes. You can have whatever feeling you want to have. Your feelings are important, and to notice why you're feeling the way you're feeling is a really robust form of insight and knowing ourselves. But oftentimes it may not be what's happening. Right. And that's also true. And that can make things complicated. Just because you feel anger and you feel like an injustice or a boundary violation is happening doesn't necessarily mean that it is what is happening. And this is where we often then can feel very sensitive to being gaslit, because then we say to the person like, hey, I'm angry at you because you are violating my boundary. And the other person's like, I'm not violating a boundary. That's not what I'm doing here. I'm just doing this. And then we feel like they're diminishing our feelings. It may feel like, they're gaslighting us. And this can get really tricky relational waters. And so to that, I say, you're allowed to feel angry. And if you feel like there's a boundary violation, it's important to get curious about it. But it may mean that that's not the other person's intent. That may mean that that's not what's happening. And that can also be a part of the conversation. It doesn't mean that you then don't get to feel angry. I mean, you get to feel however way you feel. Again, though, if you're so intent on holding on to your anger to the point of like righteousness, the point of that kind of stagnant anger where you're using it as a shield, then that's it may mean that you're going to challenge the relationship, what am I trying to say? If you're finding yourself not being willing to look at the other person's perspective and hold that both realities can be true, there is a way in which that may ultimately damage what you are able to experience in the relationship, because relationships often are two people. So there is, of course, a difference between someone saying don't feel angry. You shouldn't feel anger because that's not what's happening, versus like, I hear that you're feeling angry. That wasn't my intent. This is my intent, but I can understand that maybe you saw it differently and that you are now angry because of it. So I can recognize your anger and like, let's talk about it, right? There's a difference between those two ways of relating. But ultimately, just because you feel anger does not mean that you are perceiving things accurately. And I think anger can be really, really tricky. We can often feel very entitled with our anger. Or again, like I said, it gets turned against the self and we feel a lot of shame and we feel really wrong and bad and we shouldn't feel angry. Either way, there's an opportunity there to expand what we can tolerate of our anger so that it doesn't collapse us into bad, good, right, wrong, either bad us or bad them. Yes? Okay. Wow, this has been a long episode. I hope that this is useful for you. I know that anger can be such a complicated subject. I feel like I just kind of high level, right? There's so much more that I could talk about with anger, but hopefully this gives you just some ideas, some ways to maybe think a little bit more about how you want to relate to your anger, how anger may be manifesting for you, what utility anger, what function anger plays in your life. And maybe it gives you a better sense of like how maybe you want to do some of the internal work now, like how this may support you in changing a relationship with anger so that there is space for your anger, because anger's important. And it's such a interesting emotion. There's so many layers to it. And I hope that this has given you some insight into those layers so that you can find what works for you. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you. I appreciate you watching this. If you're watching this on YouTube or listening wherever you get your podcasts, my podcast is a little passion project of mine. It's something that I do on my spare time. And I really, really love hearing from you. So feel free to leave a comment, a review, message me on Instagram at I am Thaís Sky. I absolutely love it. Thank you so much for being here, and I will catch you next time.